guys, today we have someone very different, not an actor, not a producer, not a director, nothing to do with the film industry, but someone really, really important does change in this world. Michael Bowman. Mike, why don't you tell us what you do?
Well, my name is Sergeant Mike Bolme. I'm an investigator with the Bismarck Police Department. And I think the reason I'm here with you today, Ejaz, is because of my um, 6-year membership to the Human Trafficking Task Force and to our local multidisciplinary team, which deals with both youth and adult trafficking here locally and throughout the state.
We know that you catch the bad guys, but more than that, if you give us more details on how it happens and what your agency does, or is it an agency or are you directly with the police force?
It's a police agency within the city of Bismarck. And my job here is to investigate crimes. I've been an investigator since 2009, and I was a narcotics investigator up until 2017 when I got promoted to sergeant. And then I started to specialize more in personal and property crimes, kind of with an emphasis on personal crimes. Um, when I got promoted, when I started participating with the Human Trafficking Task Force here in North Dakota, and with our fantastic little multidisciplinary team here in Bismarck. Um, the human trafficking work is some of the most rewarding things that I do in my job right now. I love the team that I work with, and I love the outreach that we do to victims, and then of course trying to put together cases on I'm just going to call them pimps, is also very challenging and very rewarding when we can make it happen.
You get a phone call from a family member, or you get a phone call from a neighbor or whoever, 911 phone call, and you respond to that and you go there. Now, what and how do you determine that this is human trafficking?
When you're looking at human trafficking, the trafficking of adults looks a lot different than trafficking of minors. And so we get lots of tips on adults or most of the tips we get are from, I would say, like hotels and establishments like that, who suspect somebody in their hotel is either engaging in prostitution or drug dealing. Because a lot of times at hotels, it kind of looks like the same thing, right? Lots of traffic coming in and out. Hotel staff are really, really good at spotting um, not normal behavior in their guests, right? Like if you and I check into a hotel with our families, that looks like one thing. Somebody engaging in prostitution or somebody dealing drugs out of hotel looks entirely different. And hotel staff see so much of each that they're really good at differentiating. So if we get a tip from a hotel like that somebody is engaging in what they think is prostitution or human trafficking, um, we will respond to that call. And then it's our job to try to determine, based on the behaviors that we're seeing and some other things, um, what we're looking at here, and it's usually going to be human trafficking or it's going to be dealing in narcotics. We'll look at who paid for the room. We'll look at phone numbers coming in and out of the room. We'll look at traffic coming in and out of the room, things like that. And then that'll help us determine what our next step would be. And normally our next step is to write a search warrant for that room to look for evidence of specifically prostitution. And when I say that, that's what we're writing the affidavit for, as far as what to look for with the search warrant. But our main goal is to get into that room, collect that evidence, get the victim the help that he or she needs, and then try to move the case forward into who's trafficking them. Because almost inevitably, there is somebody behind the scenes, whether the victim admits it or not. There is almost always somebody behind the scenes collecting money, setting up the web pages, giving them rides and things like that. I can't think of a single time where I was told by the victim that they were basically an independent contractor just working for themselves, and then not finding evidence to the contrary, that there's somebody behind the scenes.
How and what do you find that makes you determine that this is a prostitution ring, so to speak?
Early on, when we're kind of trying to figure out what's going on with the room, if we see, and I'm just going to use the female victim, um, because that's just the most common. And I think a lot of times we miss the male victims in prostitution. But if we have a male who, while we're doing surveillance, who comes in the room, leaves within a half hour or an hour, like right on the dot, right? Because we know they set up half hour or even longer appointments. So if you think of regular hotel traffic, somebody, if we see a couple guys come and they're both gone within like an hour right on the dot, then that's a really good clue for us. And a lot of times we will conduct a traffic stop on people leaving that hotel room, um, and try to further the investigation that way. Um, those conversations are really interesting because you can imagine how sheepish those men are. I'm just going to say men because usually it's men. They're usually pretty easy interviews, and usually we get some pretty good evidence about what they were doing in that room. And then if we are able to build a case and get a search warrant for that room, things we're looking for are sex toys, money, electronics. You know, you can't really engage in prostitution or human trafficking anymore without a cell phone or some kind of laptop, some way to connect to the internet because it's all advertised online. So we're looking for that sort of thing too.
Is there a type, or are there just anyone and everyone could be a victim?
I would say the only common denominator between victims is usually some sort of childhood trauma, some sort of childhood sexual abuse, or like extreme neglect. Um, there are no gender or racial or age or any other connections that I can make with victims other than that trauma piece, which comes from their background usually. And it usually started with some sort of sexual assault, either by a family member or somebody associated with the family, things like that.
The Johns are are they arrested?
Part of my job with the Human Trafficking Task Force is I teach at what's called the Demand Reduction Program. And the Demand Reduction Program is if you get caught trying to buy a prostitute in Bismarck, you have to get sent to what's called the Demand Reduction Program. And that program is geared at educating men on the harm that they're causing when they try to purchase another human being. Because part of the problem, it's actually a male culture problem, right? Like we joke about this stuff in the locker room. There's a male culture thing where we think it's basically a business exchange, right? In our culture, where we give her the money, she gives us the sex, we both walk away happy. Well, the demand reduction program is geared toward educating them on why those things are not true and the damage that they're actually causing these victims. So a lot of times, if I'll get to answer, this is a long answer for your question, but if I stop a John leaving a hotel room and I get a full confession out of him right away that helps us get into that hotel room, oftentimes I will work with the prosecutor's office and the person who runs the demand reduction program. If I can get that John into the demand reduction program, and if he successfully completes it, I'll hold those charges over his head to make sure that he does it. And then I can make arrangements with the prosecutor that they will decline charges as long as that John makes it through the school. So that's a great school, and I've seen it make a huge difference.
Reduce the demand of drugs and you won't have any drug dealers, so to speak. So reduce the demand by force or by holding the charges over their head. It doesn't matter. So now, so we know what's happening with the Johns. What's happening with the victims?
We have some really good resources here in North Dakota, and connections that my department has made with other service providers, specifically geared toward victims of human trafficking. So oftentimes I will I will get them out of that hotel and get them shelter for the night, and that's through our local abused adult resource center. And then after that, they will, if they're willing, they can receive services through the human trafficking task force, who I will contact immediately, um, upon any sort of interaction with the victims. So it's a long road to hoe, but of course, like safety, shelter, food, those immediate needs I can meet right away. And then once we get them sort of stabilized, then we can get them those other more um, lifelong services after that.
Do the girls or the boys, do they normally accept your help, or they just are scared because you are the person who may put them behind bars? And how likely are they to trick you?
It's not tricking me because I know it's going to happen. And that happens probably the vast majority of cases. I will make arrangements with that victim, especially if they're just denying that there's a pimp behind the whole thing, which is most of them, right? Even though I can show with evidence that I collected probably in that hotel room that they're not being truthful with me. That doesn't bother me. If they'll take up because a lot of times we get called to that situation, I have a duty to that hotel to remove that behavior, right? So I have two options. I can take her to jail for prostitution because if I can get a search warrant for the room, I can already prove up charges on her. But that's not my goal. If I can get her to at least get help, to at least check in for a shelter tonight and sit and talk with some of our great human trafficking advocates on the service provider side of the world, then I consider that a victory. Um, and that's most often what happens is they will take that offer of a free shelter in conversation with the advocates, and then the next day they'll disappear. That's the most common scenario. Every once in a while, you'll get one that wants to get out of the life, and that's really uplifting. But the reality of it is, you know, um, that trauma bond is so strong that it makes these cases really tough. So I wouldn't say they're tricking me. I know what's going to happen when they say they'll go to a shelter and yes, they'll work with us. They're probably going to disappear the next day. But I consider that um, the success is in the engagement, right? I may be the only cop that's ever treated them decently in their long, many interactions with the police, probably starting with they were young, probably starting with maybe us removing them from domestic violence in their parents' house, or certainly I'm really proud of the way I've been in law enforcement for over 20 years now. Our response to human trafficking has changed so much. We used to just go in there and arrest a prostitute and get on with our lives, right? Um, the vast majority of the time now, we don't make arrests, even if we are able to get into that hotel room. It's because we're trying to get the person involved now. So that's kind of what that looks like.
How does it feel to have this constant uphill battle, and 99% of the time you fail? When I say you fail, I mean the system fails because they go right back. How do you keep going? Like, what are you made of?
The outcome is not necessarily in a successful prosecution. Sometimes a successful outcome just has to be you being the one kind person in their life, probably for that month or for that year, right? Because look how the rest of the world treats them. So if I can make a difference with people that way, I mean, it kind of sounds cheesy, but it's true. It's that has its own rewards. But I do acknowledge that, especially human trafficking cases, are so frustrating because the percentage of prostitution is so low as far as pimps.
What happens if you come across a child, underage prostitute? What happens at that point?
So that's a whole different response. And I should preface this by saying the conversation around the John School or the demand reduction program, that is only for adults buying adults. If an adult is trying to buy a child, that's an entirely different thing, and they don't get the demand reduction program. They get treated appropriately. But our response to child victims is entirely different. And I have to be honest with you, about 95%, 99% of what we deal with right now as our local multidisciplinary team has to do with underage victims.
My God.
If we hardly have time for adults right now. I have 3 identified adult victims in Bismarck, 2 of which I think we know who the pimps are. And we can't find the time to intervene with them because we're so busy with the other stuff. Because obviously the child cases take a precedence there.
So when it comes to child cases, and if you're saying 99% of your cases are children, um, how does it start? And do the Johns know that they are purchasing victim? I mean, we're purchasing underage.
They do know. And it looks so much different because most of the time with the cases with minors, they're not advertised online. It's always going to be through word of mouth in friend groups or familial. We see some familial trafficking for sure. It just looks a lot different than the adult market. I guess is a terrible way to say it, but it's the only word I can think of.
These are locals, I'm going to say. I mean, local men who know that their community has children and the children are also, are the children local?
Poverty has a lot to do with these issues, and I think that's where some of that comes from. But that being said, um, yeah, they're local. These are North Dakota girls, but it looks different, I think, than you're thinking of. So most of our human trafficking charges that involve somebody purchasing a minor are because that person exchanged something of value for sex with that minor. And when I say something of value, I mean they're giving that minor drugs for sex, or they're giving that minor a ride from a small town around us to Bismarck for sex. Anything of value to that underage person in exchange for sex is a human trafficking charge. So that's where we're getting the vast majority of our cases against traffickers is coming from situations like that. And it's a statute that we just got in like 2016 or something like that, and is just now kind of getting traction.
The exchange is happening directly with the minor or it's happening through a pimp?
You don't need that third party. It's directly with the minor, and that falls under our trafficking statute, and that's why we're having success prosecuting that.
Doesn't that make it more difficult on your team to pinpoint this guy is driving another child, maybe it's his niece or nephew or who knows what? How do you determine that this is sex trafficking?
That type of behavior for that victim is going to be so normal that they don't even know it's trafficking, if that makes sense. Like that just feels like a normal way of these at-risk girls are basically the runaway girls in your community, right? And they're running away from something. And usually it's familial neglect or sexual abuse or things like that, drug abuse, certainly. So it's such a normal part of their survival mechanism to exchange drugs or whatever it is for sex that I think it makes it easier for them to talk about as long as you phrase the questions right and sort of normalize it, because it is normal for them, right? So if they think that you understand that that's just normal survival behavior for them, um, we have a lot of luck getting them to talk about it. But another thing we do that I'm really proud of our team for is we don't, when we get a report that the youth is victimized, and usually that'll come from like CPS or the schools, or it'll come through a 960, which is our state form for child abuse and neglect, right? When we send law enforcement to that first meeting with the child, we make sure that whoever's working with that child, whether it's CPS or the reporter from the school, we make sure that there's somebody who has established rapport with that child, first of all. Because me sending an investigator to talk to that child before they're ready gets us nowhere, right? They don't want to talk about it. They will just get the big go pound sand thing. So first and foremost thing our team does is make sure they're ready. And then I will send the right investigator for that initial meeting just to establish rapport. And I don't even care if they talk about the trafficking or not for that first meeting. And what we found is once you have that rapport and trust with that victim, that your investigation and the prosecution goes far better because you have a supported victim, if that makes sense. They finally feel like they have a team of people around them that cares about them um, and wants to do something about their circumstances.
Where are the parents of these victims?
You're either looking at neglect, parental neglect, or sexual abuse by somebody in the family, right? These kids are running from something. And like kids who are connected with their parents and supported and loved are generally not the ones that run away because they're running from something.
They are running away from home to escape what they are getting into, basically.
So when I get a 13-year-old who is constantly running away from home and getting in trouble, and what it looks like to law enforcement is they're just these troubled little kids who are always getting in trouble and won't listen, right? Well, that behavior is caused by something. And I'm more interested in, instead of just writing a citation for running away and sending them back to their parents, I'm more interested in why they're doing it. Because kids who are loved and supported and have good homes um, don't engage in those behaviors.
Are these kids going to school?
We get a lot of, and I can think of one right now that we're dealing with that we've actually had a lot of success with. Who the school was the ones that reported it and have been instrumental in that rapport I talked about earlier, and helping us to keep this girl kind of on the rails and getting services, getting through her degree, and trying to find out what's behind that behavior. It's kind of off and on is the answer. It depends on the victim.
Mike, I had a victim that I was interviewing before I started to write the script for my film. And of course, she is an adult now, and she's moved on with her life, and she's bettered herself and so on.
Good.
She told me that she was, I think she said 8 or 7, something like that, when she started to have sexual abuse by her father, her biological father. And her mother knew about it. She didn't think that there was anything wrong with it until she discussed it with her friend in school at the age of 11 or 12. So from the age of 8 to the age of 12, she didn't speak about it to anybody else because she thought this was normal. How do we educate our kids that this is not normal behavior? I mean, of course, if they go to school, yes, we can teach them in school. But if they're not in school, with poverty comes the lack of sending them to school. How do you educate there?
These girls are coming into contact with law enforcement too. And we have to get better about the warning signs because they're not going to tell us. like the situation that you described, they're just not going to tell us because it's normal for them. But if law enforcement stops a car at 2 in the morning and it's a 12-year-old girl with a non-family member and they're both telling different stories about what's going on, we need to start asking better questions rather than asking the girl, where do you live and how can we get you home? We need to start asking what's going on here, you know? So we have to get better about it too, but it's tough because they're they're so far below the law enforcement radar in those situations that it's really tough to address.
I can almost be certain that most of the students, I mean, most of the children that are not going to school are the ones who are falling in the hands of predators.
We have laws to where if kids aren't showing up for school, they have to be reported as a missing person. So I like to think the vast majority of our kids are in the system somewhere. Um, so I think we're pretty good about that. We're not so great about having those conversations about like, why aren't you coming to school? For cops or teachers or social workers, we do have to get better about asking those questions rather than just seeing them as misbehaving little kids.
Is there any other way to get the message across to them? I mean, luckily for this girl, she was going to school and she spoke about it at the age of 12. And if she didn't speak about it, she would think this was absolutely normal. She would think that her friend goes through the same thing and so on. Is there a way we can reach our children knowing that they are hanging out on the internet for games and whatnot? Can't can't we do something where we can reach out to them there or educate them? Not educate them because they are there to play games and meet people, they're not there to. But if you throw something at them, is wouldn't that be something for them to think about and be aware that hey, wait a minute, I'm being abused here.
My brother and I would get up and watch cartoons, right? Every Saturday morning. And I specifically remember public service announcements, educational during that time. So I see what you're saying, and I think um, I don't know about the efficacy of those commercials. The fact that I remember them at my age means that they were somewhat effective. I just don't know how you would uh, how that would look on the internet, or how do you how do you put that information out there without being inappropriate, but also being information. So that would be something for educators and youth counselors and things have to figure out.
I personally seem to feel that the lack of knowledge is where it starts, and the lack of finances, of course, is where it all starts. Finances and knowledge are the two key reasons of. So maybe we could do something to educate. I mean, as far as finances are concerned, not everybody can help everybody, but at the same time, as far as knowledge is concerned, maybe I don't know, and I'm a filmmaker. I am not saying that we should do XYZ because I don't have the knowledge of how it works, but you being in there, maybe there is a way we can help these non-school going children to know that this is wrong.
I can only speak for my area and my state, but I think especially the child um, victim thing is so unknown with adults in my state. They just really have no idea. And to my shame, I really had no idea either until I started working with the task force here. And like I said, it's like 99%, takes up 99% of our time, right? So I think it's just so below the radar, and people just don't know it exists here in North Dakota.
We were filming in Linton, North Dakota, and while we were there, I go to the gas station, and I've been to Linton this is my second film that I'm filming in Linton. So I go to the one and the only gas station that there is. So I go there, and I've known the manager who runs the place, and she's like, Oh, you are here at the right time. Did you hear what happened? I said, what happened? Apparently, there was a girl, an underage girl, I think she was 15 years old, and she was talking to this guy from Australia. He flew down from Australia, picked up his car from I don't know where, drove to Linton, put her in the car, and drove away. Some neighbor saw her and they felt like she was with a stranger in the strange car and called the sheriff. And the sheriff abducted him, stopped them and got her out. But
Oh, what a great success story. You don't want it to happen in the first place, but that's good work.
because everybody knows everybody. Now you do something like that in New York. I don't even know my neighbors. I shouldn't say that, but I don't know all my neighbors. So something like that would have not happened in New York. They wouldn't even look at you. But how is this girl going away at the age of 15 with a guy who is about 40 some years old, who's coming all the way from Australia? Are there boundaries? I don't know who I was speaking with, but I was speaking about this, and my question was, if China can stop Amazon from serving in their country, then why can't we stop people coming from overseas to uh, purchase sex in America?
Coming from the world of a narcotics investigator, our jobs would have been entirely easier if I worked in China or Russia, and they still can't stamp it out, right? But when you can restrict people's freedoms, then things get a little easier from a law enforcement perspective. But I don't want to live in that country either. So it's tougher for us, but that's the cost of freedom, I guess, right? Everything has consequences.
Do these victims, if they decide uh, I don't want to say cooperate, but if they decide to change their lives, do they have an end goal? Like, do we see them through standing up on their own feet? Like, do we see them through getting a job and working at this place? And if we do, how does your organization do that?
We do. And we have some great service provider agencies. I'll just throw it out. I don't know if you've talked to anybody from the 31A project here in
I have.
Bismarck.
I spent Stacy.
Yeah, they do fantastic work. And I can think of uh, at least two victims that Stacy is working with that um, are one of them is getting her master's degree in social work and doing awesome. Another one, I don't remember what she's doing, but she's working and supporting herself with their help, and she's got apartment rent help from them, and so we are continuing to do those services long after the cases are over. Both of their cases have been resolved. For the one that I'm thinking of, who's going back for her master's in social work, her case has been done for about 10 years. I still talk to her all the time. I would consider those two, especially, I would consider friends.
Oh, that is absolutely amazing. And for you to say something like that, you consider them to be a friend, says a lot about you. You're not judging that person for what they did in the past.
Judging people doesn't work um, no matter what you do, no matter if you're trying to facilitate change, it can't come from a place of judgment.
So I'm trying to bring as much awareness as possible, but not a lot of people. I am one of them. I had no clue. I used to say to myself, "This is not happening in America. This is my country. How can it be possible? We are the leaders. It's not possible. It happens back in India. It happens in China. It happens in Russia. It doesn't happen here." So, educating the children to know that it's sex abuse, but also educating people like me, uh, about this subject. Why is it such a hush hush subject? Why can't we bring it out in the open and speak about it more openly?
I just told one person about some of the things I know, which is you. And you're one person who now, because of what you do, is going to spread that to however, who knows how many. Like we leave ripples in a pond and we just don't know where they go. So I think you're doing exactly what you should be doing. And I have to say, I do quite a few interviews for my agency. You have some of the best questions I've ever been asked in an interview, whether it's with a newspaper or documentary or whatever the topic. Like, you really know this topic, so um, you're actually really listening to the people that you've talked to already. So congratulations to you.
Thank you. No, I interviewed 82 girls. I mean, the things that they've gone through is just absolutely insane. One of the biggest complaints that I heard from them was that the abusers didn't get enough time behind bars. That was one of the biggest things that I'm going to say 95% of the girls mentioned to me.
Because of the way our system is set up, the accused has a right to confront their accuser, which means that I have to put that victim, or our prosecutors have to put that victim up on the stand. And that victim, who, by the way, is trying to break out of this trauma bond, which is the most powerful thing I've ever seen. I have to put that victim up there, and she has to talk about the things that happened to her, a lot of which are really embarrassing, right? And then she's got to talk about it with the perpetrator sitting right in front of her, and they play all kinds of games in court. They'll fire their attorney, so then they get to question that victim themselves when the victim's on the stand. They play all kinds
Oh,
of mind games.
wow.
So what happens most often in human trafficking cases is the prosecutor will run with the human trafficking charge initially, but then almost inevitably settle out of court on some sort of ancillary charges, because they're almost always like dealing drugs and doing other things, other bad things, right? So if we can get them on drug charges or gun charges or something like that, cases that don't necessarily require that victim to get up on the stand, then it's not an easy out, but it's sort of a compromise that I see prosecutors make, and I'm not blaming them for it because I understand why they do it. But that's why we see these cases are really tough to prosecute, really tough. And I feel for the victims, I really do. Um, I don't necessarily want to live in a system where you don't have the right to confront your accuser, but in this case, I wish we could come up with some sort of exception to that rule. We make it for children that experience sexual abuse. We have some exceptions there where we can use interviews with forensic interviewers instead of actually putting that child on the stand with kind of mixed results. So I wish we had those kind of things taking into account that trauma bond, which is it's the most powerful thing I've ever seen.
What is your wish as a person in your position? If one wish was granted to you regarding all of this, what would you ask for?
I wish there was some sort of magic formula that could break that trauma bond, because then kind of everything else would fall into place. There just isn't. There's no easy answer for it, because usually it's years and years and decades of trauma. And so to try to unravel that, in the year that it takes you to do the investigation and bring it to prosecution and get them services, that would be my magic pill that I would wish for.
And for everybody who does not know what a trauma bond is, I have educated myself with that. It's when your pimp or your abuser has so much control on your life that if he'll tell you to jump out of the 10th floor, you will, because of that bond, because you trust them so much. Mike, I really appreciate you coming on and speaking to us and educating us, and appreciate your work. It is incredible. You are an amazing human. You make me jealous because you're doing something that matters in this world, and I really, really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much for coming on.
It was really nice to meet you. Thank you.